All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this screen and bring up our final project guide. I believe that's how we are titling it these days. I can't really keep up with the names we've given everything. But the guide is what we've mostly been focusing on when we have our milestone overview sessions, mostly because this is the easiest way to make sure that you understand what's expected of you for each of the critical elements. To get a better grasp on the grading bit, I recommend that you, of course, go to the rubric. We did talk about the rubric a little bit last time. We talked about how the milestone rubric has sort of a lower expectation benchmark in terms of the grading than your final project will. Just so you know, this document here, the guide, which we go over in these milestone sessions, and hopefully you're using as you do your own writing, is geared toward helping you reach that exemplary level on the final project. So it does have the final project in mind right here. So ideally, it's possible that some of you might hit that benchmark on your first try, which will be great. But if you don't, you'll get some feedback from your instructor, and they can advise you on improvements you can make from your milestone to the final draft. And that should align with what we've got outlined here. All right. So there are some questions. Someone mentioned that they didn't do well on the milestone one, that the sample provided was incorrect. Hopefully you got some good feedback from your instructor about how to improve it. And if you want to give me some specifics, I'd be happy to hear about what we can do to improve the sample. I'm going to give you my email address in the chat so we can address that. Thank you for letting us know. All right, so for this milestone, we have 5 critical elements to cover in 2 sections of the paper. So we're covering sections 2 and sections 3 of the final paper. The first section is supply and demand conditions, and this section has 2 critical elements associated with it. The first one is asking you to evaluate trends in demand over time and explain their impact on the industry and on the firm. So the really big takeaway I want for you guys from this is that you want to look at market demand. So that's the whole demand for the type of product. So if you're doing, let's say, Coca-Cola, you want to look at the market for soft drinks, not just the market for Coke or Sprite. I believe Sprite is a Coke product. I don't drink soda anymore. So that's what we want you to look at, the whole market, not just your brand or not just your company's product. So this is going to give you the ability to see general overall trends. And what does that mean for your company and the market overall? So if we stick with the Coca-Cola example, the more we hear about sugar being bad for our health, that's going to have probably a negative impact on consumption of soft drinks. So that wouldn't be great for anybody making soft drinks, Coca-Cola included. I see a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to pause real quickly. All right, so it looks like the questions are about some of the formatting. So you have my email address here. So if you have any concerns you want to share with me about the formatting, I'd love to hear them, and you can email me once we're done here or now if that works best for you. But we'll make sure that we tighten that up. So the best way to consider trends in demand over time, so in the past 5 to 10 years for the product or service that you're looking at, is to look at the determinants of market demand. So the things that make people demand stuff we call them the determinants of demand. So income affects how much people demand of any product, the price of related goods, people's tastes and preferences, population and demographics. So a growth in population overall is just going to make everything more in demand in general, all other things equal. And a change in demographics is, a certain group of people, let's say, baby boomers are getting older right now. So anything that caters to elderly population would see an increase in demand. So that would be a demographic example. And then lastly, expected future prices. That one doesn't tend to come up as often, but it might be a big player if you are doing your paper on a product that is very expensive for most households. So if you're doing maybe an automobile company and for some reason people expect prices to go up on cars in the future, that would impact demand now. So that could be something to consider. The top four are the ones that come up most often, especially tastes and preferences are usually what we see students discuss here. All right, and the second rubric element in this section is to analyze the information and data related to demand and supply for your firm's product to support your recommendation for the firm's action. So what's going to happen here is now that you've looked at the market demand overall, maybe people are demanding more of your company, of the type of product or service that your company offers. You've explained why that is. Maybe they're demanding a different kind of product, and that's the direction that firms have been going in the market. Once you've described all that, you can look specifically at your company. So the best way to start this off is to look at sales or revenue data for your company, because that's going to give you a very specific data point, which is required for this element, to say, wow, this is how much the company that I'm writing about has been selling for the past 5 or so years. So sales or revenue in dollars is one way to look at it. You could also include number of items sold. So if you're doing automobiles, you know, for Ford, you could say they sold this many cars each year for the past 5 years, and see how that's grown over time or decreased if that were the case. Netflix, you might use number of subscribers to show their growth. For Netflix, I believe it's only been growth over time. You might also want to use something like, in addition to sales and revenue, something like number of locations. So that could get at how your company is supplying their product to their customers across the world. So like if you're doing Starbucks, you could look at number of retail locations, or if you're doing another retail type company like Nike, or you know, you could look at number of locations they've opened. You could also look at number of factories. If you have any sort of manufacturing company, or even like Sam Adams, a lot of students choose that one from our list. If they opened another brewery, that might be something you want to include in the data piece here to show that they're increasing their supply. All right, so once you've got some basic data to show how your company has been growing or, you know, shrinking, if that's been the case, you'll be able to talk a little bit about the determinants of supply. And so we've got those listed here as well. And again, just like above, and just, I don't know, actually, maybe there weren't any, yeah, we didn't have any links for Milestone 1, but you'll notice there are a couple hyperlinks. So we have a hyperlink to some of the videos associated with our textbook. So this is one for determinants of market demand. It just covers that concept. So you want to refresh your memory, you can come here and click right on that. It will bring you to the video. We've got the same thing here for determinants of supply. So you can refresh your memory on what that's about. And you can take a look at these. They're listed here as well, just like we did for determinants of demand. So there might be some changes in input costs that you want to mention here. A lot of students, you know, if you're doing Starbucks paper, you can talk about changes in availability of certain coffee beans and the cost of those, any technological improvements that might impact your firm. The price of substitutes can be an impact, the overall number of firms in the market, which you can bring up here, and you're going to investigate a little bit later as well. And just like before, expected future prices. That last one we don't tend to bring up as much, but it's something that if you find that it's relevant to the story of your company and how they're supplying to their customer base, then you can mention that here as well. All right, I see someone noticed that they lost sound. Okay, it wasn't everybody. Sounds like Ellen can still hear me. All right, are there any questions about either of these two elements in supply and demand? I've seen some questions about Milestone 1, and it looks like Ellen and Bill, you guys have done a very good job. Thank you so much at addressing those, and hopefully people can send me some emails too if they have some specifics they want us to correct. All right, so Gilbert asks, when we upload Milestone 2, do we go ahead and have Milestone 1 attached also with flow from Milestone 1 to the other? Gilbert, that's really up to you. I see a pretty good mix. Most of my students will submit just Milestone 2, but if you keep them together, if you prefer that just for your own purposes, just to keep it as one, continuous paper, just know that your instructor isn't going to go back and see any edits you've done to the Milestone 1 parts if you have made any edits so far. They will review that on the final draft, any edits you've made to the whole paper, but they won't be looking at stuff from Milestone 1 while they're grading Milestone 2. So I just want to make sure that that's clear if you do include everything when you submit. Vicky, yes, that is my email address. So Denise asks how many charts are required. Denise, I would say at the very least, you should have a chart that includes the sales data for your company for the second critical element in supply and demand conditions, at the very least. Some students find relevant data for the market overall. So maybe they'll find something like, if we have used the Starbucks example again, how many coffee drinkers there are across the world, or the price of Arabica beans over the past 10 years. They might find information like that that's relevant to their firm or to the market overall that they want to present in a graph form, or maybe you find a relevant graph in your research that fits into one of these critical elements, looking at trends in market demand and then looking at demand and supply for your particular company, and you can include those here as well. But at the very least, the revenue graph should be included. All right, so hopefully I answered those questions. And yes, always good to double check with your instructor. Sometimes it's easier to keep the milestone separated, just so your instructor can hone in on those sections. But always best to double check with your instructor. So Thelma asks about help with citing. So Thelma, if you scroll up, I believe that Ellen, I don't know if you included a link up there. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Ellen. So Purdue University has a great general guideline for APA citations, for in-text citations, and for your reference list. Our Shapiro Library and our Online Writing Center are also great resources for this. If you've never used the Shapiro Library or the Online Writing Center, I find them to be pretty self-explanatory once you get to the sites, and they're all, they have links from the classroom and they have links from your Blackboard homepage. But if it's something that you're not sure how to navigate, your advisor can help you with that too. They're really familiar with all the in-house resources and can point you in the right direction, on a quick phone call. So Kendra asks if using the bullet points as shown here might be easier to keep the information more organized. Kendra, you might not be addressing each one of these determinants in detail. Some of them might be more applicable than others. So you might find that a bulleted list might not make as much sense in this case for determinants of supply and determinants of demand. If you are addressing each of them and you feel like you have a blurb to say about each one of them, then I think that that's a great idea. But I wouldn't box you into that. It might not make sense for everyone's paper. That's a great, Kendra, though. I do want to follow up with that because this is going to be helpful on the next section. So when we get into price elasticity of demand, in this section, we also look at the determinants of that. And that one, to get an exemplary grade, you do need to address each of the 5 from that are listed here and that we cover in our textbook and we talked a lot about in our discussion last week. So that might be a good place because you know that you have to address each one for full credit on your final draft to make a bulleted list to make sure that you don't miss any. So I'm seeing a few people typing. I want to make sure I don't miss any. Vicki, I wouldn't worry about using bullets and the page count. If you're addressing each of the critical elements and you want to take some space to go through let's say the determinants of price elasticity of demand that we've got here on this page, that shouldn't, if they shouldn't be spaced out so much that they're going to have a huge impact on your page count. Yes, Vicki, content is definitely more important than page numbers, and I'm sure that the other instructors online can agree with me on that one. Yeah, I would say most students, because of the use of graphs and charts, most students don't have any problem reaching the 7 to 9 pages that are outlined. I think 7 pages is probably, if you were incredibly concise and didn't use many charts, you might be able to do it. Most students find that they're more on the 9 to 10, maybe even more than that page end because of, adding in graphs and things. So page count has not usually been a problem, at least in my experience. Okay, so looks like, oh, there's a question about Aetna. So Timothy asks, he's doing his paper on Aetna, and he asks if he would suggest using statistics from health insurance as a whole or focus on Aetna. So Timothy, it depends on which section of the paper you're working on. So the first, if we go back up to the first critical element in this section, supply and demand, you are looking at the whole market. So that wouldn't just be Aetna, that would be the entire insurance market, health insurance market. So you're going to want to look at trends in demand there. From that, you move into the next element, which is specific to Aetna. And there you're going to want to put, Aetna's revenue information, maybe a number of subscribers as well. I don't know exactly how they report it. I haven't read a paper on Aetna, so I haven't seen what kind of information they give in their annual reports, but I'm sure they have something beyond just revenue in terms of numbers that you can include. And then I want to make sure I didn't miss any other part of your question. And then for the price elasticity bit, so for the price elasticity bit, that's actually a great question. So Timothy asks if he should look at insurance as a whole in terms of price elasticity or specific to Aetna. So if we actually, let me scroll down back to there. We skipped over the first price elasticity element. I'll come back to that. But if we look at the second one, and we see the 5 determinants of price elasticity of demand, this fourth one is definition of the market. So how narrowly do you define the market? So health insurance is in that case, that's the whole market. So that's a very broad definition compared to just demand for Aetna health insurance. So demand for health insurance overall, I think we could probably guess, looking at the other determinants of price elasticity of demand, that it would be pretty inelastic. People need health insurance, and so they're willing to pay a lot of money for it in most cases. So we would expect it to be inelastic. Now, if you have the choice between many health insurance providers, maybe demand for Aetna in particular is not as inelastic. It'll definitely be less elastic than demand for health insurance in general, since you have the ability to pick. So I could pick Aetna, I could pick Blue Cross Blue Shield, whoever else. But so the more substitutes there are, availability of substitutes for a particular company, Aetna being your company, then the more elastic demand is going to be for your company in particular. So if you only have maybe 2 health insurers who work in your area, then you don't have a lot of options. So even at the brand, even at the company level, rather, demand for an inelastic product might still be pretty inelastic. If you've got tons of companies to pick from, like, if you were just shopping for shoes, then any one shoe brand might not have a very high, would be much more elastic demand because, I don't like these heels, but I can go check out all these other brands of heels and, you know, shop around for a better price. So that's how you can kind of distinguish between the market level price elasticity and the company level price elasticity. So it falls into that sort of definition of market fit. And that's something we sort of encourage you guys to address, which brings me to my point up here. The first element in the price elasticity of demand section is asking you to analyze information and data to justify how the price elasticity of demand for your product is determined. So one way that we find that students can do this as a jumping off point is to find some research done by professionals in the field on the price elasticity of demand for your product in general. So in Timothy's case, he could go out and do a little bit of research and should be able to find some information on what's the price elasticity of demand for health insurance in general. And then from there, you can back it out and say, well, if this is the price elasticity of demand for my product or service overall, then I know for my particular company, it's going to be more elastic because there's some level of choice for most of us. I don't think most of the companies that students pick aren't pure monopolies, so there's going to be some choice. So it's always going to be more elastic at your own company level. And the more options there are for the more competitors there are in the field, the bigger the difference between the overall market elasticity and your own company's elasticity that they face. So I hope that makes sense. So if you think about it this way, if you're like a Sam Adams is a good example. There are so many beers these days. They couldn't just raise their prices willy-nilly and expect people to still buy as much. You not see a pretty steep reaction, most likely, to their particular beers because people can pick from so many other different beers. But if all of the beer industry at the same time raise their prices because, you know, maybe it's more expensive to make beer this year, then maybe customer demand overall in the beer market might not be that responsive to the price increase. But if any one company did it just by themselves and all the other companies left their beer prices the same, then they'd probably take a big hit. So that's the difference, you know, again, at the market level versus the firm level. So again, for this first element, you can get an easy way to get that information and data is to get it at the market level based on research done by professionals. This isn't stuff that, and you know, in an introductory class that we're going to be able to do. For most of you, the vast majority of you, you're not going to have access to information where you can calculate your own price elasticity of demand. To truly calculate a price elasticity of demand, you know, in the way that we've learned it, you need a price change and a quantity change that happen kind of at the moment. So if you were to get price and quantity data, you might get it over a year's time. You know, maybe you get it in an annual report for 1 year, and then you get similar information in an annual report for the next year. But that's a very long time span. And so that could also capture some increases in demand overall. So, you know, we talked about population. The population is generally always growing. So companies might just be selling more no matter what. So that is going to kind of distort your ability to tease out consumers' reaction to a price change. So like I said, the expectation is not for this first one, analyze information and data to get the price elasticity, for you to do the price elasticity calculation. There might be a couple instances, depending on the firm that you've picked, where you could do something like that, or you might be able to find some research from someone else who's done something like that. I've seen some examples from Starbucks, where students have found information on consumers responding in an immediate way to a price change, and Netflix. I've seen students be able to find something where they might be able to maybe not particularly calculate, but have some data to specifically say demand is elastic or demand is inelastic. All right, looks like there's some questions about price regulation that are being covered. So I'm going to let you guys continue with that conversation. Thank you, Rick and Ellen, for jumping in on that. All right, so we've talked about the first element. We've talked about the second element, where we do encourage you, in order to get full credit on the final draft, to cover all of these elements. And then lastly, to wrap up the price elasticity of demand section, you're going to look at how the price elasticity of demand impacts the firm's pricing decisions. So really what we want you to do here is to show your understanding of the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenue. So depending on whether or not you've determined demand to be elastic or inelastic will kind of inform how the company might make a pricing decision. So with the case of inelastic demand, if a company feels the need to raise prices, let's say their costs have increased, and they're passing some of those increased input costs onto their customers, they know that based on inelastic demand, they're not going to see a drop in revenue. That's the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenue. On the other hand, if they know that demand for their product is elastic, then raising their price, let's say, in response to their own prices internally increasing, then they would lose revenue based on this relationship. There's other things for them to consider. This wouldn't be the be-all, end-all decision of a company, but a company needs to know that if they change their price, how is that going to impact their total revenue? So another good example would be a sale. So lots of stores, especially retail stores, have sales. We all know that. So what is a company thinking when they have a sale? They're not. Usually the thought is not that I'm going to lose a lot of money. I'm not going to lose a lot of revenue. The thought is that, well, consumers will respond by buying more. They'll come in for the sale. Maybe they'll buy a bunch of other stuff. So the idea is that it would increase total revenue. So that might be a relationship you see where demand is elastic. They're trying to steal business away from their competitors by cutting costs for that weekend or that month, and that demonstrates that relationship again between price elasticity and total revenue. All right. So that is the last one. And again, we do have a hyperlink here. This is the same as the other ones. It's going to link you to a quick video going over the concept from our textbook in case you need a refresher. You can, of course, go to your textbook as well to refresh your memory on that. So it looks like there's some action in our chat. All right, I don't see any particular questions about the elasticity elements left to be answered. Hopefully I didn't miss any. We do have a couple minutes left, so I'm glad we were able to get through everything before 9. If there are any other questions about any of the 5 elements that we covered or any other general questions, feel free to type them in now. We have 1 more minute, and then we're going to welcome our 202 friends. You're welcome, Vicki. Thanks so much for coming, for your questions. I'm glad you found it helpful, Kendra. Thanks, Melvin. Thanks, Charles. Oh, so Lynn has a quick question. And this actually, well, applies to 202 as well. So Lynn asks, should our research be from scholarly sources? Lynn, some of your research is going to be from the annual report, which is a primary source. I don't know if I'm not actually sure if that counts as a scholarly source since it's not written by scholars, but it's provided by the company. So a lot of your information is going to be from there. Information from reputable news organizations or industry magazines is absolutely fine. And of course, if you do find scholarly research, especially like on that elasticity question where I said you could find research done by professionals to find the elasticity price elasticity of demand for beer overall, or whatever your product might be, that should be that could be a scholarly source. But I don't think that you're limited just to scholarly sources. I think there are some instances where a reputable news site or magazine is acceptable. And then for the history of the firm, which you've already done for Milestone 1, a lot of that comes from either the annual reports or from the company website. So those are some instances where it might not be, it's more of a primary source than scholarly research that you're citing. All right, thank you guys all so much for coming. And those of you who are here for Eco 202, thanks for joining us. We are just 1 minute over time, so pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and pull up our final project guide for macroeconomics. Make sure I find the right one. Always the challenge. I've got a lot of files floating around saved in here. Okay. Our time tonight should be fairly quick because we only have 3 critical elements to cover for 202. So I'm going to give just a minute, let people settle in. All right. Hello, Helen and Al. Thank you guys so much for coming. So for Eco 202 students, our milestone this week is focused on fiscal policy, which we're also covering this week. So there's some nice alignment there. You're going to get to, read about everything. Hopefully, I would get your homework done as soon as you can, so you feel good about your research and writing for this bit. It is only 3 critical elements long, so it's a little shorter than your last milestone, so that's good news. So just a quick reminder of what fiscal policy is, because I know you were only just introduced to it this week. Fiscal policy is government spending policies aimed at having some impact on the economy. So there are lots of things the government spends money on that we wouldn't necessarily consider fiscal policy, because they are not meant to have an impact on the economy itself. So the most obvious one would be a war. We go to war for geopolitical reasons and we spend money on that and we make a decision about that, sometimes separate from the economy. So fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. Thank you, Ellen. Is government spending choices aimed at having some impact on the economy. So whether the economy needs help in growth, if GDP growth needs to be addressed through fiscal policy, spending and taxation by the government, or inflation or unemployment. Those are usually the 3 areas that they target. The federal government can sort of pull the levers on how much they spend and how much they tax to have some sort of impact on the economy. So you learned this week about what that looks like. What does it look like when the government changes their spending policies or their taxation policies in order to help the economy grow? What does spending and taxation policy look like when they're trying to slow the economy down, depending on what the situation is at that time? So hopefully, once you've done all your reading, if you haven't already, and been in touch with your instructor, if you have any questions about what all the stuff means, you'll be able to apply it to your time period, the 10-year time period that you chose. So for the first element, you're going to sort of lay the groundwork for what fiscal policy looked like at the very start of your chosen decade. So because fiscal policy is in response to the current economic climate, it's always changing and adjusting. It doesn't stay the same for very long. Congress votes on changes to taxation and spending all the time. So within a 10-year time period, there's definitely going to be some change. So you want to lay the groundwork in this first element here, in this first slide, and talk about what it looked like at the start of your chosen decade. You might need, because Congress passes laws and those laws take time to go into effect, let's say you chose the 80s. you might need to look at some decisions that were made by Congress in the late 70s and that were then in place in the 80s. That might just something for you to keep in mind. But you're going to want to get the lay of the land. What were they spending money on at the time to impact in a way to impact the economy, and what did taxation policy look like at that time? Had taxes recently been adjusted to go up for certain groups? Had taxes recently been reduced for certain groups? What are the specifics around that? And then you'll see that once you get this baseline, those things are all going to change at some point in the next 10 years that you cover. The taxation rates most likely will not stay the same across the board. And the spending approach, the spending programs won't stay the same either. So this gives us a starting off point. Yep, and Ellen also mentions you'll want to explain the rationale for that as well. So if you find, we'll stick with the 80s example, if you found in 1979 there was a specific tax policy change, a tax rate was changed, you'll want to explain why that decision was made. Was it to help the economy slow down because inflation was too high? Was it in order to increase GDP because GDP wasn't growing fast enough? Those are the things that you would look at and explain here. We have a couple of links for you, and these are just starting off points to help you out. This is by no means the be-all, end-all of where you can start your research. I very much encourage you to use the Shapiro Library as well, because that's a great way to get to sources that you might not have access to if you just do a Google search, because a lot of the stuff is behind paywalls. But these are some good sites that have a lot of free information. The Congressional Budget Office is a great primary resource. They review policies put in place in terms, when a tax policy is changed and signed into law, or a spending policy is put into law, the Congressional Budget Office reviews that and the impact of that. So that's a wonderful resource there. The White House website is a great place to look, because they compile action, things signed into law by the president, whoever was president at that time, and you might be able to find some information there when a spending or taxation policy was put into place. And the National Bureau of Economic Research is another good one. They're just a typical research firm. They're not specific to fiscal policy, but they do cover things that would fall under fiscal policy. Some of their stuff is behind a paywall. So if you find something there that you think might be helpful, see if you can get it through Shapiro Library. Some of their stuff is accessible for free. Anna, I would say the one secret to getting the information is to search by president. So if we stick with the Reagan example, you could easily type in, Reagan fiscal policy, Reagan taxation, Reagan government spending, something like that. That's usually the easiest way. If you try to type in a year, 1978 fiscal policy, you're probably not going to have as much luck. And honestly, I found that as a jumping off point, not as a way that you can actually reference, but Wikipedia is often a good place to start. You should not cite Wikipedia. I can't really stress that enough. It can't always be reliable, but Wikipedia does link to scholarly sources. So let's say you go to the Wikipedia page for Ronald Reagan. There's going to be a whole section on there on, government spending and taxation for him, and, fiscal policies that were signed into law while he was the president. And you'll see there that they've got, citations to where they found that information that you can then follow. And then at least you'll know the names of things and what happened, and then you can search more specifically in Shapiro Library or in Google. If the link isn't working, you can just Google the White House website, Jennifer. If the White House website link here is not working, I'll double check it once I'm offline tonight, once we finish up here, and I can update this file. But it's just brings you to the home page. Yeah, Anna, one other thing I would mention, and Ellen and whoever, and Billy, oh good, you're still on the line. A lot of the times they're called an omnibus budget. I think that I don't know if it's always been that way, but oftentimes, the big budgets that Congress passes and then is signed by the president, they're given that name, and then there's, a different number. Every year, every time they sign a new one, it gets a different number. So that might be another thing to look for in terms of a trick to find what you need. Because again, all this stuff has to be passed. Congress has to vote yes on it, and then it has to be signed by the president. So those are the places where you're going to want to look for that stuff to see what was put into law. So the omnibus is often what it's called, and I feel like there's another one, common budget term. It's on the tip of my tongue. It's actually past my bedtime, so I don't always stay up this late. Yes, Ellen, yeah, that's the collective one overall. So within that budget, there's often, things that students will want to focus on related to fiscal policy and to bring up. But it's a good trick if you don't know where to start. You could read through what's in there. And the other one is the taxation rates. So you could find, income tax rates and see how that's changed. That should be something easy enough to Google. So that's another good jumping off point, just to look for, just to search, federal income tax rates and corporate tax rates and see how those have been adjusted over the years. I've found some good graphs on that. All right, I see some typing, so I'm going to wait before I move on, just in case I miss anything. Okay. So the next element is called fiscal policy actions. So this one is actually very much the same as the one you just did, except that instead of saying what fiscal policy looked like at the very beginning of your chosen time period, you're going to describe changes that happened throughout the decade. Just a note of advice or caution, however you want to put it. Some time periods have more fiscal policy actions than others. And next week, we're going to be talking about monetary policy. That's what's done by the Federal Reserve, our central bank. Some time periods have more action done in the monetary policy umbrella. It really depends on the time period. If you are doing some research and you're finding lots of stuff about interest rates, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, the Fed, that is not fiscal policy. That is monetary policy. So please save it for next week. That's what we're gonna read about that next week. It's gonna be in our milestone next week. Anything that you talk about here should really fall under the umbrella of taxation or spending. And it's what's decided on by Congress and written into law by the president, signed by the president. If it's done by the Federal Reserve, it should not be here in your fiscal policy section. So you're going to find out what changes happened throughout your 10-year time period. You're going to focus on the most important ones in most cases. Again, some of you might have very active decades, some of you might have less active decades. So once you have a few things that you're going to talk about, a few policy actions that took place throughout your time period, just like you did before, you're going to talk about what the reason was for that. But we're also asking you to take it a little bit further and really employ the macroeconomic models that we've been developing to explain why that action would lead to the outcome desired by the government. So if the government did a specific thing, they changed a tax rate in order to increase investment or just increase GDP growth, let's say, something more broad. How can we use our macroeconomic models to explain that approach? How do these principles and these theories that we've been exploring this week explain that action that the government took? So that's kind of your goal here, is to say this was the action, this is how the theory or the model. We've got some links to the models that you can use. How does that support this choice by the government? How does it explain it? You might want to have a different slide if you want to talk about very different policy actions separately, and it's hard for you to combine them onto one graph, into one little story. That's fine. You can split them up into different slides if that makes it easier for you. Some students have successfully quickly created their own aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. You don't need to have numbered labels on the axes, on the y-axis and the x-axis. That won't be necessary. We just would, if you wanted to do something like that, show the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, you would just be showing the movements. You don't need to have hard numbers like sometimes our textbook might show. So that's an option as well. Donna asks, how many policies should we include? Donna, it depends on the time period, so I can't give you a number. But yeah, like Ellen said, all of the major ones. So once you feel that you've gone through all the presidents in your time period, because every president gets a new Congress typically, because that was another voting cycle. So there's new people voted in, and they're going to start making new decisions. You want to make sure that you kind of cover anything that happened under any administration. If you find that you only have one, I would keep looking. There are some time periods that have a handful that you need to go into pretty good detail about. Usually there's at least something on the spending side and something on the taxation side to talk about. They might both be around the same time and for the same goal, in response to something particular that's happening in the economy, and that's okay. But there's still two separate actions because, or, even the tax rates, you can change a couple of different tax rates at one time. So, Reagan, I keep using that as an example. I like the papers on the 80s. He changed a lot of tax rates. Some he increased and some his administration decreased. So, you can look at, there's lots of different ways to break it down. It doesn't have to be all umbrella. You can kind of drill down to get more specific if you're having a hard time, but there's no hard number. As long as you don't leave out anything major that happened, you should satisfy this section. And the other thing to note, Donna, is you go through the presidents and also make sure you kind of cover the years. You might not have something happen in every year, but let's say, again, you're doing the 80s and you just mentioned something in 1983. Chances are things involving fiscal policy happened after 1983. So we would expect to see some sort of range throughout the decade in terms of policy actions, generally speaking. All right, and the very last one, and actually I need to update this slide. We've updated a little bit to better match up with your rubric, so I'll talk about that now. But you're going to look at the fiscal policy impact. So what that means is the government took this action. What was the impact it had on the actual economy? How did it affect the economy overall? And how did it affect households and businesses within the economy? So like we said above, the government decided to change a tax rate because they wanted to increase GDP growth, let's say. Did they achieve that aim? After they put that policy into effect, did we see an increase in GDP growth? Do you think that that was the reason why? What was that the impact of that tax? And then we'd also like you to look at it at a more micro level. How did that policy impact businesses directly? Well, they saw their taxes decrease and then they were able to invest more money into their businesses. We see that in the investment data from Fred, something like that. Or we see a change, there was a change in income taxes and that affected people's spending. And so we saw this change in consumption among certain households. So those are the ways that you can look at the impact overall. You can look at GDP, you can look at inflation, you can look at unemployment if those are the goals. And then you can also look at specifics at the household and the business level to explain how the policies impacted those groups. So Anna, yeah, on the above slides, especially on this one, fiscal policy actions throughout your time period, you're going to talk about what the policy was, why it was implemented, and how the models explain that. So the government increased taxes in order to slow down the economy because the economy was overheating. That's a term, that's a term we like to use. When inflation is too high, we increase taxes. That's one way to help contract, slow down the economy. And using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, I can show you why that would work. Why would increasing taxes help decrease GDP growth? Our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model can kind of show that. So that's what you're doing in this section. And then, but again, that's kind of the theory, right? This is what the government did. This is how the theory explains it. Down here is what the actual impact was. It's not always the case that the policies work the way that they were intended. Sometimes the size of the policy is not appropriate to the economic problem that the government's trying to address. Sometimes the timing is off. Sometimes it was just ill-conceived for other reasons, and hopefully, your research will bear this out. That's another time where the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that's linked up here, is a good resource for this, because they will go back and they have a lot of writing that analyzes policies that were put into place to see how they actually impacted the economy. So that's one place where you can reliably find some of that stuff, the impact. But a lot of it you can just, you can look for yourself, and we encourage you to look for yourself in the data. A lot of the data you already have. So you've got the GDP numbers and the growth numbers, you've got the inflation, you've got unemployment. And then you could look more closely at things like business investment, all the stuff you can get from the same place, from Fred, from that database. You can look at, consumption just by, regular consumption spending in the economy to see if that was impacted. Things like that. You could look at home sales if that's something that's part of the story, or there's lots of more granular things you can look at, but the mainline things, the GDP growth rate, the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate, you already have. All right, and that is it. Those are the three elements. I know we talked a lot about this on Milestone 1, but just in case you weren't able to join us then or weren't able to watch the recording, I do always like to remind everybody that you do need to include speaker notes. If you take a look at the rubric, in order to get a proficient or better, you need to include speaker notes. So if you fail to include speaker notes on any of these slides, you risk getting scored in the needs improvement category. And on the final draft, that is a 55% grade on any particular critical element. So if your entire project had no speaker notes on the final draft, you would risk an F just because of that. So it's very important. I really can't stress it enough. Include your speaker notes. The slide itself should be pretty clean and basic and just have the main points and, of course, any graphs that you want to include. You do still include in-text citations as needed on the slide. So if you borrow a graph from a source, or if the data that you put into your graph that you made yourself is from another source, you would cite that source. And any text that you happen to include, it should be brief, but any text you include on the slide, if you need to cite the source where you got it, you would cite it with an in-text citation. And then your speaker notes will give a more detailed explanation of what you've got on your slide. We'll, go into detail about, what if you included a table or graph, what that all means. If you've got some bulleted things listed, go into more detail about each one of those. In your speaker notes, again, just like with the slides, anything that you're referencing from an outside source, you would use an in-text citation. And all the in-text citations you have throughout the project will come together on your reference list for the full citation listing. So someone asked, just to make sure, we are only required to turn in these specific slides. We would submit updates to Milestone 1 at the final submission. Yes, you're only going to be graded this week on these 3 slides, Marjorie. So you only need to be submitting these 3. And then, of course, the reference slide as well. that'll be down here. You should always have that because you're always going to be citing things in any of your slides. And then all of the slides are going to come together as one big presentation for your final draft. And you will hopefully have made some edits based on your feedback at that time. And your instructor will regrade everything based on the final project rubric, which is a little bit, has the higher expectations than the final draft, which we talked a little bit about. Well, we talked a lot about at our last webinar. So this guide is meant with the final project in mind, to help you meet the expectations of the final project. Even though you might not necessarily hit that mark for your milestone this time, that's the reason we have the milestone, so that you can get some feedback. You can make some tweaks, make some edits, improvements, and then show that to your instructor in the final draft of your project. So at the very least, for this submission, you should have 5 slides. You should have a title slide. It can be a title slide specific for the milestone, or you can just keep it as your overall slide that you're saving for everything. It's a presentation title slide. At the very least, 3 for fiscal policy. How fiscal policy was at the start, actions that happened throughout the decade, and how our models explain them. Again, this is where you might be including more, but at the very least, you need 1 slide. And then the impact and the reference slides. The reference slide will be your 5th. Yep, so Anna asks about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So yeah, aggregate demand is, like Ellen said, the collective behavior of that would be the buy on the buyer side of the U.S. economy. So typically when we think about the components of aggregate demand, it's just all of the consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports in an economy. So anything that impacts any of those bits is going to move aggregate demand. And it's the reason that it looks a lot like what we see in microeconomics. Hopefully everyone took microeconomics first. I find that it generally goes easier that way because you get introduced to supply and demand there, and then aggregate demand, aggregate supply is a little bit clearer. We see the same downward sloping relationship between price level. So instead of prices, there's no one price, but price level in the economy and quantity. So what we use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model for, though, is to see the relationship between those two, and then, of course, how they shift. So when we look at aggregate demand, and a lot of the stuff that you're looking here in fiscal policy is shifts in aggregate demand, so how that whole line moves. So any changes in any of those components, consumption, investment, net exports, or government spending, will shift the demand curve out. So any increase in any of those things will shift the demand curve out, the aggregate demand out, and any decrease in any of those will shift it back in. And then you, just like with supply and demand in microeconomics, where they meet is where the equilibrium is. And then aggregate supply, that's just how much businesses, suppliers in the entire economy are supplying overall. So again, it has that same relationship we see in microeconomics where it's upward sloping. And it shifts in a lot of the same ways too. So when input costs go up for suppliers, that shifts the supply curve to the left, because they can't supply as much when their costs are high. So a good example of that is like when oil prices get very high, that affects a lot of businesses throughout the entire economy. So that has an impact on aggregate supply. Suppliers find it hard to supply as much because they've got this added cost of high oil prices that affects so many companies. So we see it economy-wide that there's a shift in supply. There's less supply at any given price level. So, that's a very basic introduction to how we would think about shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply for our purposes here. Of course, I encourage you to check out some of the things that Ellen is talking about in terms of resources. I'm trying to think of one offhand that I know the name of. I find that Crash Course Economics, I think I've shared that one with you, Ellen, and Bill, and I don't know if you've seen it, Kiara, is a really good one. Khan Academy has some good ones that go through it in a little bit more detail. Yeah, Crash Course, I'll type that one in. Crash Course Economics. I find that their explanations are very good, and they're well edited videos. I like Khan Academy too, because he does the problems out, but sometimes I find the production quality not as nice as some of the other things I found on YouTube. Yeah, Kiara, I also like that one. So Anna, that's another one. MJM Foodie, she also has very well created videos on YouTube, little cartoon based ones, but they're very well put together. Yeah, exactly. They're easy to follow. Yeah, but actually, I've shared a lot of videos. I don't know if they have one specific to aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but the Federal Reserve has a lot of videos on YouTube, and if you sort of look under, if you Google like Federal Reserve and students, they have a lot of resources for students, and I'm sure that they have something on that if I had to bet. But yeah, I would try those few on YouTube. Crash Course Economics. So Ashton Mintz is AC/DC Economics. That guy, AC/DC guy, he is on Crash Course Economics. I find the AC/DC ones a little bit loud. I don't find the production quality as good as the ones that he does for Crash Course. So it's like the same guy, and he's really great at what he does, but it's more like he got a better production team. Because I think with the AC/DC ones that he just did on his own as a high school teacher. But the ones that he does for Crash Course Economics are professionally done. Yeah. So if you liked him, if you like the AC/DC ones, you'll really like the Crash Course ones. Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that you want to understand when it comes to aggregate demand and aggregate supply is how they shift, especially for your work that you're going to do here for our final project. So I see some people typing. So I'm gonna hang on. We're a few minutes over, but that's okay. Yeah, and the neat thing about YouTube and why I like using it so much whenever I am looking to learn about something new or get more information about something is once you find one video, it suggests other similar ones, from other people. So like Ellen said, you can get a well-rounded perspective, or different ways of explaining the same thing when you do it that way. So, YouTube's such a great resource. I love it. Can't tell you how many things I've looked up there. And then you can find what works for you. I mean, you might start watching a video and be like, man, this is not doing it for me. Whereas another student might love that same video. So it's a nice way to sort of, you read through the textbook and you read your instructor's announcements and you feel like, okay, I'd really like something a little bit more on this topic. It's a good way for you to take kind of control of that and find something that works for you. Whereas like, you ask me, I'm happy to give you suggestions, but maybe what I suggest isn't best for you. So I think YouTube's a great way to sort of filter through. There's so much out there. You can find what works best. Yeah, so Anna, the way that it relates to this is, especially on the fiscal policy side, the fiscal policy side is going to be on the aggregate demand side. So they're looking, well, government spending itself is captured in the aggregate demand curve. So an increase in government spending, no matter what they spend it on, whether it was fiscal policy or some war, if there's an increase in government spending, that's going to shift the curve out. So that's one thing. So when government decides, man, we want GDP to increase, so we need to move the aggregate demand curve out to the right, we're going to increase our spending to do that. That's one way. They're making G bigger, and that's C plus I plus G plus X. Another way they do it is through taxation. When they reduce taxes, either on businesses or people or both, they put more money in businesses' pockets and in people's pockets. So when businesses have more money, they can invest more. So that increases investment, and that's C plus I plus G plus X. And then when people have more money, it increases their consumption. They have more money to spend. So C will increase, and that's C plus I plus G plus X, and the aggregate demand curve will move out. So that's the main way we're applying it here for this particular milestone, what we're doing here. Monetary policy is going to be very similar, but they go at it a different way because they obviously don't control government spending. Oh, great. Thanks, Ellen. All right. Yep, so tomorrow morning, this will be on the YouTube channel. I'll get it up as soon as possible. Oh, yes, I'm supposed to be getting one too. My mother just sent a message right before I got on the call. She's up in New Hampshire. She's actually not far from where Snoo is. The sky was like purple, bright purple. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen anything like that. It was pretty cool. So Donna asks about war spending. So war spending will move aggregate demand in general. I know it increases G, government spending. It's not fiscal policy. So war spending is something that you might talk about in the last milestone. So if you want to go back and include that, if you didn't already, that might be something to include. So, major events of your decade, of your time period, a war would certainly be one of them. Okay, and what's the impact that the war has on the economy? One of those impacts is increasing government spending. Yeah, I just don't want people to confuse war spending with fiscal policy. That's all. So you definitely would talk about war spending and its effect on the economy, Donna, just not necessarily right here in fiscal policy actions, but in the events and how they impacted GDP section for milestone 1. So if you didn't include it, again, this is why we do milestones. You can go back and add that in for the final draft. So Margaret asks, how do we know if the policies are related to macroeconomics? You'll know the policies that you want to talk about are related to government spending and taxation. So government spending on things like, a good example that we're all familiar with because it was pretty recent was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus bills that people usually know it more as that, that happened right after the recession. It was started by Bush and then implemented through the first year or so under Obama. And that increased spending on things like, infrastructure projects and stuff. And it was just a way to spend government money to increase that G, push that aggregate demand curve out to prop up the economy because we were in a recession. The economy was actually shrinking. That's what a recession is. So they will spend the money that the businesses and the households are not spending to increase GDP. So that is something that, again, the Congress has to vote on, the president has to sign off on and put into law, that you'll find in the policy. So it's a specific spending policy. And taxation, of course, is always that. So any change in income tax rates, any change in corporate tax rates is something you could capture. All right, thanks everyone for sticking around for some extra questions. Um, Anna, yes. Yep. The oil crisis was definitely an important thing that happened, but it's not a fiscal policy decision. So that's just an outside event that impacted the economy. So you'd cover that in those first couple elements from Milestone 1. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night. Stay safe, those of you who are getting thunderstorms.